Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jake. This is Nerd Level Rising, and I have sort of a sequel video today to my recent video talking through the books that made me a reader as a kid. Now I want to do like the books that made me a reader as an adult and like really made me continue this journey and really spread out. And I ended that video on the idea of like I just got into that cycle of rereading Harry Potter all the time, and now I want to pick up from there and kind of go, what was the start of this big just explosion of reading for me as an adult. So that was roughly probably 20, I don't remember exactly what year it was, 2013, 2014, somewhere early mid 2010s is kind of where we're at. And, I had been reading Harry Potter over and over. I read the Lord of the Rings books, right? And then went back to Harry Potter and, kind of doing this stuff. And I was watching the Game of Thrones TV show, and I was super into it, and it was the end of a season. I think it was the end of season 4, if I remember correctly. And I was like, I can't wait, right? I want to go read, let me see what's up. Let me read these books. And I was working at a Target at the time, and we had all the mass market paperbacks there. And so one day after work, I just grabbed all of them and was able to I got my employee discount, which is kind of cool, and brought them home and just dug into book 1. That's where the journey begins, is a Game of Thrones. And I devoured these, man. I really, really did. Like these just took over my life. I was finding myself suddenly spending my entire day off reading again, which I hadn't done in a while. I found myself theorizing and I wasn't on like forums on the internet or anything like that. I wasn't really doing social media stuff really then. I was just thinking a lot and talking to some people who were into the TV show and about when I'd gotten through just the material that had been covered in the show so far, and I was just talking to them about it, and they're like, yeah, this is awesome. And then I got past where the show was, and so then we're talking about with some friends and coworkers and whatever who had seen the latest episode, and they're telling me about it, and I'm just like, I get that wonderful feeling of like, I don't want to be that person who's like, oh man, just wait till you get here in the books, right? Like I would never say that, but just thinking it in my head was so fun. It was so satisfying, and just kind of knowing where the story was headed. And then I could see how the show did some things differently, did some things the same, and then we all kind of know what the show went off and did. But nonetheless, this series, this is what changed things for me, right? This was the turn. This was that moment in time where I found an adult fantasy series with so much scope and depth, and these characters that felt so unbelievably real, and this world that felt so lived in and so rich with history and lore, and there's magic, but like not a ton, and it was different like Harry Potter magic is very different from this, right? Like it was such a different view of what a story could be, of what fantasy could be. And it was just incredible, man. And it really just took over my life there for a while. And I finished book 5 and was immediately, getting on Google of like book series similar to Song of Ice and Fire, right? Like that was just the immediate thing that I did. And I read through a bunch of these lists, and, there's a bunch of names of fantasy series, and I've gone on to read, several of them since. And, but certainly not all of them, but I got a bunch of them on my list still. And the one that was always number 1 on all these lists was The Wheel of Time. So that's what I eventually grabbed, right? Was if it's always number 1 on all these lists, on best series similar to Song of Ice and Fire, it's got to be worth it, So I grabbed this, I picked up The Eye of the World, and immediately was brought in just with that title, right? So what an interesting title. And I love these book covers to death, right? I love these just really classic fantasy style covers. So cool. And then I get into the story, and again, it just swept me up immediately. And in hindsight, I can see how heavily inspired by Tolkien this first book was, and then it went off and sort of did its own thing after that point. But maybe that's why I loved it so much, is it had that familiar sense, and it had, a lot of these things that I knew that got me engrossed into these characters, into this world. And then it took me off on this journey, and it wasn't as intimidating because I'd had something familiar to grab onto, Regardless, Wheel of Time, this became my new obsession, right? I read all 15 of these straight through. I didn't take a break and read other series. I read it actually incredibly slowly because during the time I was reading this is when I went back to school. So after high school, I was nudged towards going into engineering because I was very good at math and physics and things like that. And I went for one semester at a community college locally to save some money. Absolutely hated it. Dropped out. Worked full time for like 4 years, 3.5 years. And I was like, when I figure out what I want to do, then I'll go back to school. So in the meantime there, I found out what I wanted to do, decided to go back to school. And that was when I was reading The Wheel of Time, you know? So I remember bringing these books with me, and I have all the mass market paperbacks because they would fit, well, one, because they were the cheapest, right? That's why I bought them. But it was nice because it would fit on the top of my lunchbox. So when I was carrying my lunchbox around, I could just let this sit on top so it didn't get torn up in my backpack all day. And I would read those like in the middle of the day. I had a lunch break, so I would just, sit down, eat a lunch, read a little, half of a chapter or whatever, right? And I'm going through these very, like I'm seriously, I'm reading 10, 20 pages a day, right? It took me forever to read this series, but it was still just such an incredible journey. So much of it has stuck with me. So much of it, honestly, I've forgotten a good amount of stuff, right? Because it's now been, 8-9 years since I read a lot of these books. And so I'm really excited to go back and reread it at some point. And in fact, I'm seeing like the trailer for season 3 or the teaser or whatever for the TV show just dropped, and it's got me already like, man, I want to reread those books. That'd be fun. It'd be super fun. And I would love to read them a bit faster this time. Not saying I want to speed through them, but just, read like a full chapter at a time to where the ideas are together, right? I think that would be nice. But anyway, Wheel of Time was just incredible. The ending blew me away. I was worried as I go through this series. I'm like, okay, well, the author passed away. Number one, that's horrible. But number two, like, what can this new person, like, who can this random dude finish this story, right? Because I had never heard of Sanderson before, and so I see his name in the last 3 books. And I'm just like, oh boy, like, please don't ruin this thing that I love, dude. Like, and he didn't. Right? And I think he did an incredible job. The ending was so sad. To this day, it's still one of the most satisfying endings that I've ever read to any story, outside of one, what happened with one villain character that I will just leave there. If anyone, if you've read the story, you probably know there's one anticlimactic thing. But other than that, it was such an incredibly satisfying ending. And I love it to death, man. I have a tattoo on my leg of the Wheel of Time. Like, I love it. So that was absolutely massive for me. And I think just as instrumental as that was, is it introduced me to Brandon Sanderson, who became an author that I've read a ton of books from, right? So that was really what was next. Was after I finished this, I was like, I really like what this Sanderson guy did. Where should I start? And the internet told me to start with Mistborn. So I grabbed Mistborn, and this, again, huge shift, right, in what fantasy can be. These are very traditional fantasy in some ways, right? Like, obviously, George Martin stuff, you get into some of the grimdark things. You get that really gritty, morally gray characters, very realistic, very honest kind of story. Wheel of Time, very traditional, but obviously he's doing some other stuff, right? Really high magic, a lot of stuff going on. This, much more simple magic in some ways, right? Almost like video game kind of story, right? In especially with the magic system, with hard magic systems. And the prose was much more streamlined and simple, and not bad, right? It was just different, just simple. And I flew through these, and I loved Mistborn, man. I still love Mistborn. It was, I haven't read them since then. It'd be fun to go back and reread these. Someday I will do a full Cosmere reread at some point. I don't know when, but someday it'll happen. But I love this, and again, it introduced me to a new thing, an author who would go on to become one of my favorites. A style of magic, right, that I hadn't had a hard magic system before, so this was my introduction to that I really enjoyed. I like both hard and soft magic, right? I think they both are awesome, but this was just, it was different, right? It was different, and it was so satisfying to see that, to get this a trilogy, right? Which you might notice is a new thing, that I have an unfinished long series, an incredibly massive series, and then now I got to do a trilogy, and I was like, okay, satisfying, it's nice, it's tied up, yes, cool. What's next, right? So I got to just kind of jump around a bit from there. And from there I jumped around quite a bit, right? I went back and reread some of the Drist books, and what else did I do? I did there was a couple other, I'm blanking on it right now at the moment, but eventually I went back to my list of like, what are these things that are similar to Song of Ice and Fire? And another one that pops up a whole lot is Malazan, Book of the Fallen. And I eventually grabbed this was October of 2019. I remember it very well, because I opened this up for the first time at the same moment that I sat on an airplane for the first time, which is when I was coming down here to visit this grad school that I wound up going for my master's and am now still at for my PhD. So that's when I opened this series for the first time, and it shattered everything in my being of like what fantasy could really be, right? This series, not only does it, truly embrace the just dropping you into a world and letting you experience it, right? It's not going to tell you anything. It's not going to hold your hand. There's things that you will not understand even after you finish the entire series, right? And why is that? Because the characters don't understand it. That's how honest this, like that to me, like that is the word that really encompasses how Malazan works to me. It's like honest, right? It's brutally honest. And it's so real. The characters are so real. The ramifications are real. Just how things work. Right? If the characters don't understand how Warrens work, why can I expect to understand it? That doesn't make sense, right? So that was such a eye-opening thing. The sheer scope of what's going on in Malazan, hundreds of thousands of years of history, tons of different, very unique like races, fantasy races, all these different cultures, different continents. It's hard to put into words, right? There's just epic is like, if there is a book series that encapsulates what epic is, it's Malazan. And so that's why that is on this list, because it really was so eye-opening, and it was so just, I keep saying eye-opening, but it's true, man. Like all of these have been very distinct phases of my journey as a reader, and just seeing what is out there, what can be out there, what type of quality can be out there, what type of depth, what kind of world building, what kind of, everything. And I think these are, obviously they're all adult epic fantasy stories, but they are, well, I guess Mistborn you could argue is, some people say it's YA, whatever. But there's a huge spectrum here, regardless, So I think Malazan was very instrumental for me, and is also the first instance of me starting to be like, okay, the prose matters to me a lot. It's not everything. I can still really love, Sanderson's still one of my favorite writers, right? And his prose is not amazing, and some can argue in Wind and Truth it was just not good at all. But regardless of that, I still find myself more and more and more now, ever since Malazan, seeking out, let me get some great prose, right? Like that just, it just feels so good, right? And that's part of, if you watch the channel, I love Sun Eater, I love Janny Wirtz. Like these authors that the prose is such an integral part of what they're doing. That's really important to me now. And I think that Erickson was the first one who showed me that, which is just super, super cool. And the last one on my list here, from there, right, I read the whole Cosme, I read Stormlight, I read, I read Dune, tons and tons and tons of stuff. I shouldn't say tons and tons. I read a bunch of John Gwynne, I read The First Law, so there's quite a bit of stuff going on that were amazing. I love that those have been part of my journey so far, but I wouldn't say that they were as instrumental as some of these, and even as Red Rising was. And stick with me, okay? Because this book, particular, right, Red Rising, book 1, is I didn't like it that much, right? Like I liked it, but I didn't love it by any means. Golden Sun, I loved. Morningstar, I loved. Everything else I loved, right? And it's one of my favorite series, and I can't wait the day that we get the announcement of the release date of Red God. I am gonna, it's going on my reading schedule in permanent ink on release day. I'm opening it, right? But this book 1 it didn't floor me. It was, everything that I heard. It's kind of YA, it's Hunger Games, it's, all this stuff, which isn't bad. It just isn't really my thing personally, right? But what Red Rising did is it opened me up to what sci-fi can be. And I had not read much sci-fi up to this point, right? I read a couple of Star Wars books, like as a little kid. I read some Artemis Fowl when I was really, really little, but like I haven't read any adult sci-fi yet. And the first adult sci-fi that I read was the Dune series. And I love Dune dearly, right? I love Dune. I love Dune Messiah. I love Children. I even love God Emperor. I had a great time with Heretics and Chapter House, right? They're my two least favorites of the series, but I still really liked them. And then the next, I was like, what sci-fi series should I get? And, a lot of people, Mike's Book Reviews, first and foremost, was starting a reread of this in the lead up to Lightbringer. And I was like, let me do this Red Rising thing. That'll be my second sci-fi that I do as an adult reader here. And it's very different from Dune. Like you can see some of the influences, right? But it's very different. It's very fast paced. It's just action, action, action. And it's also very deep character work, right? There's a lot of just fantastic. So the dialogue, even, right? Like everything with that Pierce Brown does with his characters, and I think it's gotten better and better book to book as well, is just fantastic. And I'm not saying that the characters in Dune are super shallow and not interesting to read, or I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that Dune is boring. But I love Dune, guys. I love it. But this is just very different tonally, right? It's very different. They're doing two different things. And so this was like, oh, like, okay, I love the Dune stuff, but I can have this too? That's awesome, So it really just kind of broadened my view of what sci-fi could be, and has gotten me excited about doing more and more sci-fi. And I still haven't read a ton, after this I was like, okay, well, what should I do next? And I started Sun Eater, and obviously, if you watch the channel, you know how much I love Sun Eater. One of my all-time favorite things. And I read a handful of Star Wars books, and I've read, just some other sci-fi here and there. And I haven't done much older sci-fi yet. That's very much on my list. But it's just cool that this really opened me up to at least some of the breadth that sci-fi has to offer. And so I had to include that on my list here, and I'm excited to see how it continues, man. I mean, I've been reading adult fantasy now for whatever it's, I don't know, 10 years, 12 years, whatever that is, which is not that long when you think about it, especially when I did not read a ton up until, 3 years ago was when I started reading, like, quite a bit, to where I'm reading, 30, 40 books a year, something like that. Before then, I was reading maybe 10 books a year. So it wasn't a ton. So I really, there's so much out there yet for me to see, for me to experience, for me to read. And I just can't wait to see how this journey continues to evolve. So with that, if you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. Tell me what you liked about it. In the comments, please tell me what's going on with your reading. What have you found as an adult that made this like part of your identity, like it has for me, right? Like we are readers, and it's awesome. It's so cool. I love that we have this community. It's so awesome. And, I got actually a lot of awesome comments on that other video I did about like what made me a reader as a kid, of people sharing the stories that really made them fall in love with reading for the first time. And I learned about a bunch of series I've never been on my radar at all. And that was super cool. So I would love for that to happen again. Like, let me know, what were some of these things that you started with? What did you fall in love with? What opened your eyes like me? Maybe you have these different aspects of the space that your eyes were open to because of these different authors or different series or whatever it is. Just talk to me down there. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. That's fun to see that number go up. Fun to build this community. Fun to meet more people, talk to more people. It's awesome, man. It's awesome. So with that said, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.